Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in to the kind of more of the message part of Joe Knows. So I'm going to be sharing some things with you today that I think will be maybe a little bit moving to you and maybe hopefully help you as you prepare for your life, for the rest of your life. But I just got back. I don't know if you noticed my shirt here. This is an African shirt, and I say that because I bought it in Africa. And I was there for about 9 days, and I did some speaking. And one of the things I did was with Job, the book of Job in mind. I've been teaching and walking us through the book of Job, but in doing that, I kind of launched off and got into a little bit of my and my wife Tony's story about some of the ways that we have experienced suffering in our lives, and it's been an ongoing thing. So I just want to remind you, in the book of Job, we begin where Job is called the most righteous man in all of the East, and I think that covered a good part of the earth at that time. He was a great man. He had gained God's attention for how righteous he was and how God-fearing he was, and in a dialogue in the heavens, the angels and Satan was there as well, and Satan began to accuse Job and to say that the reason Job was able to follow God and willing to follow God so readily was because God had blessed him. He was a man of riches and wealth. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and Satan began to discredit. God actually began to brag about his servant Job, and Satan began to discredit him and saying, come on, he's a fair weather follower of yours. He follows you because you've taken care of him. You've given him sunny skies and blue skies and sun, and it's really wonderful. And God allowed, the book of Job then goes into a phase where Satan is allowed to get at Job. Now, it wasn't the hand of God, it was the hand of the enemy, but God allowed it. And Job began to suffer tremendously. He lost most of his possessions. He lost his children. And then in the second phase of Satan's attack on Job, he lost his own physical health. And Job began to suffer just physically, horribly, in horrible ways. And Job's friends show up and they think they have the answers, and they give all the, I guess if it is a modern day thing, they gave all the Christian answers that we would say, hey, read the Bible more, hey, pray more, hey, what sin is in your life? And none of them know that Job is in a situation where he is actually proving that his faith is real. In the heavens, God knew it, but he has to prove it. Job is proving that. And really, a book is going to be written where we can look at Job and be encouraged ourselves when we suffer. That's what's happening behind the scenes. And his friends give him all the wrong answers. And I'm going to probably wrap up maybe next week, maybe the week after that. I'll wrap up the study in the book. But what I wanted to do is take a pause. And I want to talk to you about some suffering that I've experienced in my life. Okay, so I was born and raised in New York City, became a Christian when I was 22 years old. I was at a very low point in my life. A broken relationship is what took me to the depths of the depths, and that was when I found God. I found the Lord, and he stepped into my life, and he changed everything on the inside for me. It didn't change necessarily my circumstances, but he changed my life, and he gave me a path and a purpose, and I knew that God was with me once I opened my heart to Christ. And I've never been the same since. And then, it was through a broken relationship that this happened. So I took about 2 years off of dating because I was so hurt by the way I was betrayed in that relationship. And then I started to date after a couple of years of being a Christian. I had to learn what it meant to date it in the right way. I had done things that were very selfish and self-centered, but now I wanted to date with God, in God's way, with God's blessing, and it took me a while to figure this out. But when I started dating, I just found I couldn't really find the right person. And finally, I met Tony, and Tony knew that I was the right person for her before we ever met. She had seen a picture of me, and somehow God had put in her heart the thought that I was the one she would marry. I never even met her. And I started hearing, I was off in Bible school. And as I got back from Bible school to the church, I became an intern at the church, and she was I had heard that she was interested in me, and I really wasn't that interested. to be honest with you, in the beginning. And I really was in a state where I was trying to protect myself because I didn't want to be hurt again. I didn't even realize it, but we began to date, and I finally dropped the wall that I put up to protect myself from being hurt again, and then I fell in love with Tony. And I quickly realized this was the one that God had for me to marry. And we were about to get engaged, and something strange happened. Tony began having second thoughts. Now you say, well, why is that strange? Sometimes people have second thoughts. Well, it was strange because I remember going to her house one night, and she said, hey, I'm not really sure I can be a pastor's wife. I already was a pastor by this time, and she started to question that. And I would convince her, I knew she could be a great wife to me. She didn't need to be a pastor's wife. She was going to be my wife. I was the pastor. I was a youth pastor at the time, but I needed her not to be my ministry partner, but my life partner. And I knew she can do it, but she didn't think she could do it, and she began to have questions, and I would convince her. And I'd go home, and she'd say, yes, we can do this, we can get married, and I was getting ready to buy the engagement ring. And I'd go back to her house the next day, and I'd have to have the same exact conversation with her that I had the night before, because she would just go back to, well, I don't think I can do this. And this went on, it seemed like every night. I don't know if I was at her house every night, but she was going back and forth on whether she wanted to marry me, whether she could marry me, whether she was attracted to me, whether I was too short. There were all these reasons she was giving me. What it really was fear, a fear that was being fueled by a mental illness that she has called obsessive compulsive disorder. But I didn't know this. And after 5 months of just about every night having to reconvince her that she could be my wife and that we should be married, after 5 months of having to do that every night, I finally had to end the relationship. Because I knew that she couldn't go through with the marriage, and I broke up with her. It was one of the hardest things I ever did. But I did it. I knew I had to. And then God, after 11 days of me crying day and night, because I lost my best friend and the person I was sure I was going to marry, God just stepped in and healed my heart. And we were apart for the next 10 months. But it wasn't too many weeks after the breakup before Tony realized she had made a mistake. Now, we didn't know that this was one of the ways her illness, her mental illness, would present itself, but it wasn't going to be the last time that we saw this enemy come into her life and take her and me down with it. So we got together after being apart for 10 months, and 5 months later we were married, and we had, and things were just amazing. Now, not perfect marriage, but marriage that was being perfected, and we were so happy, and I always knew she was the one I was supposed to marry. That's why I cried for 11 days, because I felt like somehow God had lost. Now, God doesn't lose, okay? He doesn't lose, but things don't always go the way we think they should. And now that we were together, it was amazing. We had our first child, we had our second child. I was a youth pastor at the time in New York City, the church where we met, and then we moved out to California. I continued youth ministry there, and we got pregnant with our third child, and we stayed in San Diego for about 2.5 years. Some of you wonder, how could you do that, Joe? San Diego is such a great place. Well, it just wasn't. It was a season for me to be there, and then we moved to Texas, and we had our third child, and my wife began about 9 months after Jojo, actually it was 6 months after Jojo was born, our third child, she began to have that, what we now knew was the OCD showed up again. And she began to have some fears, just fears that were not realistic, but they were very real to her. And I remember it got to the point that my wife couldn't get out of bed. And she wound up staying in bed. Now we were married, we had 3 children, they were all young, and my wife stayed in bed for 9 months. 9 months. 8 months of it were in our house in Texas, and after that, her mom was coming over to help. This is a crisis, you know, I'm a single, she's in the house, but I'm having to do everything, and the church I was at, we had a growing youth ministry that was amazing. They provided me with a nanny to help. because they wanted me to keep working. And I knew that I couldn't continue forever with her in that situation. And I had gone back to San Diego to speak somewhere, and it was during that time that I asked the Lord what I needed to do. I was considering stepping out of ministry so I could be there for her. And the Lord said, no, I'm going to heal her. She's going to be healed shortly. And I went back from that trip, and she was in New York with her parents on an R&R 30-day recovery kind of deal. And it was during that time that she was restored. My wife came home. It was 9 months altogether, and she had the big smile on her face. She'd gained all the weight that she lost, and she looked like $1 million. And things were great for quite a while. We went at that point 14 years without, well, actually, excuse me, I'm getting it wrong, okay? She was better for quite some time. But then a few years later, in 2002, it hit again. And this time was even worse. And there was a pattern of every time she got sick, it got a little worse, a little longer before she came out of it. This new sickness that started in 2002, again, it was the OCD. And now she was diagnosed also with something called schizoaffective disorder. And this episode took 2 years for her to get through. And we were able to get the proper diagnosis, proper medications, and she wound up just coming out of it completely after 2 years, though. And during those 2 years, she was out of the house for 5 months in New York, hospitalized for 2 months, and we finally felt like we got to the bottom of it. And when she snapped out of it, it wound up being 14 years with not a sad day. Now, I believe that God had healed her, and I think he did to an extent, but those 14 years, unfortunately, came to an end. And about 3.5 years ago, I started to see, after a while when you're with someone, some of you might be listening, and if you know someone that experiences or is close with someone that has mental illness, please send this to them. And then feel free to have them contact me, because I understand this as an observer. I've watched this. And I started to see, about 3.5 years ago, I started to see things happening that were familiar to me. And I began to panic. And there didn't seem to be a way to stop it. And my wife went again into about a 2.5 year in and out bout with this serious depression. And the OCD. The OCD has to do with an obsessive thought, which to my wife is a fear, followed by a compulsion, something that makes the thought go away, but then the compulsion reinforces the fear. And now, by answering the voice and trying to understand and put the fear to put it down, she reinforces the obsession, and before you know it, it's just out of control. And partway into this 2.5 year bout, she was hospitalized. It wasn't last December, the December before, 3 different times. And it just didn't help. And then she got out of the 3rd hospitalization, and she came home, and she just began to get better. I don't know how to describe it other than it just began to pass. But again, the first time was 5 months. The second time was 9 months. The third time was 2 years. And the fourth time, it was 2.5 years, and it just began to settle down. And I remember last year, I felt comfortable enough to go to Africa last year on my ministry trip. I just went on one, like I said, this year. I went last year. And I remember coming back from Africa. It was an amazing ministry trip, coming back. And my wife had gone to spend time with her family in New York. And we met back in Texas. When I came back, she came back. And I remember saying, oh my gosh, she's restored. She's back to normal. And I was just on the top of the world. Because watching your spouse suffer that way can drain the life out of you, particularly when you don't feel there's anything you can do about it. And it seemed like it passed. I was on the top of the world, and that lasted for about 30 days. And there was a day. And if you remember in the book of Job, it talks about one day. And Job, everything changed for Job. There were 2 of those days he had in his life. Well, there was a one day, it was a Saturday. And I remember we went to my son Christopher's house, and Chris and Kelsey were planning to surprise us and let us know that we were about to have, they were pregnant with our first biological grandchild. That's why we went there. And they told us, we were ecstatic. Tony was just on the top of the world. And I remember we were in separate cars, and I went out in the driveway to leave. It was raining really bad. And I watched my wife leave the house. She walked out the front door. I was watching her from the driveway, sitting in my car, and Chris was watching her from inside the house. And as she walked down the concrete walkway, there were 3 steps that she needed to walk down to get to the driveway, and she never saw those 3 steps. And I watched my wife step off those steps and land on her temple, on the left temple of her head. And that was one more of the 1 days in our life, because that was just about a year ago. We're about 3 weeks short of it being 1 year that took place, and my wife has not returned to being the same. And she's only been back to normal for 30 days, but she's not the same yet. Now we're trusting and hoping and praying she's going to get better. She had a traumatic brain injury. It caused double vision, which is only corrected with special kind of glasses. And it jarred her brain to an extent that it really affected her ability, her mental acuity, her ability to even think and reason. And it just took us to a new place of suffering. And I remember going through it for the first 6.5 weeks. I was I was pastoring a church at the time. And I was trying to juggle and continue to pastor. I was just showing up on Sundays, and I was in the hospital. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks. And I was with her the whole time. And when we got her home, it wasn't like she was better. She had all kinds of things going on. She wasn't able to think straight, and she would have psychotic kind of episodes where she would see things that weren't happening. And I'm trying to walk through this with her. And I'm being strong on the outside, but on the inside, I was crumbling and falling apart. And I remember about 6.5 weeks into it, something significant happened with me and the Lord, and he pulled me out of it. And I didn't pull her out of it. I still was walking her through this, but he pulled me out of it. And I now was able to rise above the circumstances and walk through this with faith and with trust. And I was amazed. And I remember I asked the Lord, I said, Lord, I am living above this now. People would say, Joe, how you doing? And I would say, before that, I would say, I'm surviving. But after that encounter with God, I was like, I am doing amazing in spite of my circumstances, but I was living above them. And it was then that I learned that you can live above your circumstances. And I asked the Lord, why did it take 6.5 weeks? Why couldn't I do it right away? I said, where were you then? Now I see you so clearly. Where were you? And he said, Joe, he helped me understand this, and I want you to hear this. He said, I was right there where I am now, but you were so focused on the storm, the thunder, the lightning, the rain. I don't mean literally, I mean figuratively. The wind that you never saw, that I was standing there wanting to lift you above this and help you carry it through and help you walk through it. And that was amazing. And really, from that point on, I just was able to be great. And I quickly realized that I couldn't pastor the church anymore. The church that I started 19 years previous, I wasn't able to. I was going to have a new way that I did my ministry. It was going to have to be from the home. And I went to the elders, and I stepped down and laid my ministry aside. And that was also how I earned a living. Now I have some real estate investments. We'll get to talk about that a little bit as I talk to you in the days ahead about real estate and the opportunity it can afford us, but I didn't have an income. So here's what took place. On that one day, when my wife, and I hate to say this in a crude way, but it really helps you understand, when my wife's left temple hit that cement, everything changed. In a sense, I lost my life partner, at least the way I had her. Now she's still here, she's in the house, we're together, but she's not the same. I lost my ministry, the church I started and had pastored for 19 years. I needed to walk away, and I lost the way that I earned a living in one day, in one moment. And yet God was able to carry me through it. And God has, first of all, I'm here. I work out of my house. I have a ministry called Square One. It's a counseling and coaching ministry. And I lead people, and I counsel people from my home. And I can keep an eye on Tony. He gave me a great church, okay, another church, a young church. I feel like I'm a youth pastor again, which if you know me well, you know that's always been my heart, is working with young people. I get to do that. He gave me this new ministry, Square One, and he provided for me a salary that more than replaces the salary I was making when I was at Crossroads, the church I pastored. He did all that. And I had always planned, when I was right before the situation took place where my wife had the injury, I was planning to teach in the church on the book of Job. But I didn't get to preach anymore. Once I stepped down, I didn't have a pulpit to preach from. I didn't have an audience, okay? But what I did was I kept reading the book of Job over and over and over again. And I planned to teach it, and that's what I'm doing now. I have a ministry now, a platform ministry, where I do Joe Knows, which is a 5-minute little information, wisdom bite, and then it's a sermon that I preach, and I'm doing it right now. And I always planned to teach the book of Job, and I always thought of myself as Job, as the one who was suffering. Shortly after I began teaching through Job, the Lord gave me a word, and here's what he told me. He said, Joe, by the way, keep preaching the book of Job. You're going to help people. But he said, by the way, in this narrative, this modern day narrative, you're not Job. He said, Tony is. He said, Joe, you're not the one that's suffering. It's Tony that is. And it's the truth. Because I watch my wife suffer, and I'm not Job. My wife is Job. And yet God has a purpose in her suffering as well as mine. God has a purpose in your suffering, as well as if you have the opportunity to endure the suffering of a spouse, or of a child, or of a friend, or of a parent. You see, suffering is part of life. And God gave us, he allowed Job to go through what he went through so that we would have hope, because I don't think any of us, listen, my wife is Job, but she didn't suffer like Job suffered. And neither have I. She came closer to me, but neither of us is even close. So we have a reminder in the scriptures that no matter what we face, God will never give us more than we can handle. And with the suffering, with the trial, he'll provide a way to escape, a way to live up and to endure while under it. It's not automatic, but God is there for us. And that's what I wanted to share with you today in my sermon. It's not really a sermon, I guess. It's a testimony, really. I don't even have my Bible with me, okay? But the Bible is in my heart and in my mind and in my life. And sometimes we have the opportunity to live out some of the things that God wrote down for us. I bet you're in a situation right now where there's something that you're going through. It doesn't make sense. You don't like it. You want it to be taken away. But God is able to, with whatever you're going through, without taking it away, to allow you to go through it and not around it. I want to close by saying this, that early on in one of the earlier episodes of Tony's sickness, I remember I began to feel like I was losing it emotionally, mentally. And I got really scared because Tony, it was one of the time she went to New York for 5 months. I was now the single parent for 5 months of my 3 young children. And I was taking care of them, and I began to feel like I was about to lose it myself. And I remember asking God, begging God, take this away, heal my wife, take it away, make it stop. And I remember this is what the Lord told me very clearly. He said, Joe, I'm not going to take it away. He said, what I want you to do is put your arms around your wife's illness and embrace it. He said, you are going to find my will for you going through this, not going around it. if I take it away, Joe, you won't be able to do the things I'm calling you to do now and in the future. So as I sit and tell you my story, maybe it brings hope for you. Well, I wouldn't have been able to give you that hope if he would have taken that suffering away. So maybe my suffering benefits you. My wife's suffering benefits you because we can tell you that we're still going. We're still believing. We're still trusting in God, even though sometimes it's hard. It's hard, especially for her. And maybe someday, as you go through, as you put your arms around the things God allows in your life and embrace it, maybe you too will find His will for you going through those things, not around them. Listen, you pray for healing and you pray for miracles and all those things, but when they don't come, continue to walk faithful with Him. I hope this is helpful to you. God bless you. I'll see you next time.